A quick search of the term Quran or Islam and science will reveal many articles, books and videos about how the Quran is in conformity with modern science. The conclusion is then that this is proof Islam is the true religion. Here is just one example from the many that makes such a claim. This one is written by a well-known apologist. The full link to the literature is in the description. After citing so-called scientific miracles of the Quran in the following areas, within the conclusion section on page 47, he goes on to say, the scientific evidences of the Quran clearly prove its divine origin. No human could have produced a book 1400 years ago that would contain profound scientific facts to be discovered by humankind centuries later. The Quran, however, is not a book of science, but a book of signs, and it goes on. Here is another well-known book making the claim between Quran and science. But the Quran is the same book that presents the story where Moses splits the sea with a stick and crosses it with the Israelites, the same stick that previously turned into a snake. Scientific research does not suggest any of this is possible. The Quran presents a version of the biblical tale in which Jonah is swallowed by a whale or big fish and then lives in it for some time while praying. Scientific research, however, suggests that a person could not persist very long inside a whale's digestive tract. They will be crushed by it or by the water pressure and almost immediately suffocate. Shooting stars are thrown at the devil in Quran 67:5, and in Quran 29:14 Noah lived for 950 years. Biologically, it is not possible for any human to live this long. In Quran 12:93, a blind man's eyesight is brought back again by a piece of clothing, and so on. The Quran describes earthquakes, blizzards, hurricanes, floods, and other destructive natural activities as being a punishment for the people that it is inflicted upon, as described in Quran 29:37. Noah's flood is described as a punishment in Quran 11:43. Research, however, has not found any correlation between a civilization's religiosity and their susceptibility to these or other types of natural disasters. To point to the Bible by saying it has the same or similar narrative does not further the argument that the Quran is in complete conformity with science. The apologists will then shift the burden of proof and argue these are miracles, phenomena that are outside the testable realm of science. But miracles and science are not compatible. They are mutually exclusive and incongruous. Muslim apologists can make the claim of miracles, in which case they are to remain a fideist, because they cannot also then claim that it is a book that contains scientific facts discovered centuries later. However, apologists want to have all the benefits of the situation, whether it be miracles and also the science claims. The hypocrisy is that on the one hand, they argue that their belief is scientifically unfalsifiable, because belief in the Quran for them is supra-rational and is the ultimate yardstick. The irony is they still believe in miracles, which falls outside of science. The point is, they cannot have it both because science and miracles are irreconcilable. Further, this sort of contingency is precisely what the apologist rejects when a negative scientific evidence is put on the table, attempting to refute the Quran. Say, for example, the impossibility of virgin births, existence of demons, angels, etc. Here, they would simply shift the goalposts and argue that it is a category mistake to judge the Quran using science. It is here that the Quran suddenly becomes a book of signs, not science. The ludicrousness of this oft-repeated mantra is that in the English language this soundbite sounds good and catchy. In Arabic it is not, which is Al-Quran kitabu ayat wa laysa kitabu ilm. Nevertheless, the absurdity and hypocrisy of this position is glaringly obvious to any honest person. Muslim apologists often argue that the scientifically false propositions in the Quran, such as shooting stars thrown at the devil, and others as aforementioned and exampled, are merely allegorical, miracles, or unknown in meaning. But how does one ascertain whether a verse is really literal in talking about scientific principles or is of unknown meaning or allegorical? The standard is as arbitrary as apologists are applying it, as they define tacitly that the literal verses are those by which scientific merit can be found, though contested as it is, and those of allegorical or unknown meaning are those wherein, given scientific exegesis, scientifically false propositions can be found. But to do such a thing is to beg the question. In other words, the apologist assumes a priori that the Quran could not possibly be false, and thus, for the statements that appear to be false, the apologist argues are merely allegorical or of unknown in meaning. But this is the very precise assumption that the apologist seeks to conclude. Given this, the enterprise is again guilty of begging the question. An example of the aforementioned is that amongst apologetics there also exists the disturbing tendency to simply make scientifically false statements. For example, covered in a previous video of a well-known argument is the claim that the Quran predicts that salt and fresh water do not mix. The problem is that the argument is simply wrong, as fresh and salt water do mix, yet such false claims continue to be purported by them. Often the remarks are prefaced with a discussion with another, or Western academics are cited who purportedly support the idea. Thus they appeal to authority, especially non-Muslim ones, thinking it validates their arguments even more than Muslim academics. Notwithstanding, given the ambiguous nature of the verses and the out-of-context remarks, the same academic who has no understanding of Arabic, the religion of Islam, or the Quran is often deceptively and surreptitiously shown a translation of the verse which has been contrived and skewed incorrectly to fit with a scientific claim. The unaware academic is made to think the Quran is in harmony with the science. Often such an admission is made by them after they have been known to receive financial benefits from their benefactors. Nevertheless, once it is proven categorically that the Quran is wrong in its science to the apologist, they then shift the argument to semantics, Arabic grammar, and linguistics. They will say the Quran is actually saying something else instead, and it is still in harmony with the science. Here is a video showing an example of this type of dishonesty.
For instance, when we look at Aristotle's words, when we look at the descriptions of the Quran, we see a correspondence.
Well,
that is
you haven't
evidence.
shown us any correspondence.
Yeah, that's the point. That's just a
You
statement.
haven't shown us. This is a statement. Aristotle is like the Quran. How? How?
Aristotle also describes the emergence of bones and muscle
Right.
in sequence.
Right.
Okay.
And it's like the Quran.
And it's like the Quran, which
Well,
is
does Aristotle say the bones come first and then the flesh and the muscles? Does he say that? Are you sure?
anybody somebody that works.
I'll let you think about this.
Well,
Anyone that
if
works
you
with
are
my
you
son
are
would
you
feel
is that what the
ridiculous.
Quran-
I'm not saying
wait,
it. Can you
is
are
that
you
what
sure?
is that what the Quran specifically says?
Absolutely. This is exactly what the Quran says. Chapter
We're done
23.
because you just demonstrated the Quran is wrong.
Yeah, but
How?
Professor Myers.
Because
How
that's
is it
not
wrong?
that's not what happens in the
Well,
book.
this is what the embryologists are telling us.
The
This is
no,
exactly
they're
what the
not.
embryologists are telling
No,
us.
they're not.
Okay.
Embryologists.
Let me tell you what Keith Moore said. I mean, you can disagree with him.
He doesn't like Keith Moore.
I don't know why you don't. What he said on the page number 364A of his book, The Human Embryo, that in the 7th week the bones are formed, and immediately after that the flesh is formed, and the flesh, the bones
is
are clothed with
nonsense.
flesh. Well, Keith Moore is wrong. He's an embryologist. This is his field.
It's my field too. I know he's wrong.
You're an embryologist.
That yes.
Oh, great! Wow, wow, that's news to me. Okay.
So that's wrong because what happens first is you have differentiation of mesoderm.
Right.
That within the mesoderm you have segregation into things like embryonic mesenchyme, and then you have these cartilaginous centers that will form bone.
Right.
And these are forming simultaneously with each other.
Right. Simultaneously.
Yes.
Even if that's the case, the Quran is right, because thumma is very, even if that's the case, linguistically the Quran is right. Thumma literally can in Arabic language means things happening simultaneously. Yes.
As well.
Yeah.
An organization called the Commission on Scientific Signs in the Quran and Sunnah was set to publicize what it calls scientific signs found in the Quran and Sunnah. It was founded by Sheikh Abdul Majid al-Zindani with the backing of the Muslim World League in 1984, Saudi Arabia. Incidentally, al-Zindani was one of the spiritual advisors of bin Laden. Many Western scientists and academics, such as marine scientist William Hay, complained of having fallen into a trap in interviews, while embryologist Gerald Goringer claimed mutual manipulation between the scientists and conference organizers. Geologist Professor Alfred Kroner said in an email reply clarifying his out-of-context remarks during one of the conferences, and has described the proceedings which resulted in his remarks being used by Muslim apologists. Found in the description below, the article in the Wall Street Journal cites these and more accounts. Maurice Bucaille was a French physician who lived in Saudi Arabia as a personal doctor to the Saudi royal family. Naturally, he developed a special relation with the Saudi king, who asked him to write a book highlighting Quranic science. He was financially remunerated by the king of a fortune of $6 million. In 1976, the book The Quran, the Bible and Science was published, which claims to prove that the Quran, in contrast to the Bible, is in agreement with modern scientific discoveries. It was immensely popular across the Muslim world, where it sold millions of copies and was translated into several languages. It is still being touted. Here is a video of a well-known apologist recommending the book to the masses. Bucaille's book became so important that a new term was invented, Bucaillism, which was used for the movement to relate modern science with Islam. Bucaillists have promoted the idea that the Quran is of divine origin, arguing that it contains scientifically correct facts and thus one of the main convincing evidences that led many to convert to Islam because of the large number of so-called scientific facts in the Quran. Despite the many errors in the book, one of which will be highlighted next, Dr. Bucaille had no knowledge of Arabic grammar or the Quran, or specialism in Islam, not to mention no specialism in many of the sciences he claims for the Quran. His impartiality was compromised by his relationship with the Saudi royal family and the money he received from them. Even curiously, despite his claims in the book, there has been no official account that he ever converted to Islam, as one would have expected given the scientific discovery claims he makes for the Quran. To illustrate an obvious tactic he employs, as many have done since, is that he takes a general verse of the Quran, which when read prima facie is not miraculous and could be made by anyone based upon observational analysis. He then embellishes the meaning to a miraculous scientific discovery like he does on page 146 of his book for Quran 22:5, shown here on the left. He then goes on to conclude this is a discovery of modern times. On the right is a full verse, and when read in context it reads, "O humanity, if you are in doubt about the resurrection, then know that we did create you from dust, then from a sperm drop, then developed you into a clinging clot of blood, then a lump of flesh, fully formed or unformed, in order to demonstrate our power to you. Then we settle whatever embryo we will in the womb for an appointed term, then bring you forth as infants so that you may reach your prime." There are a few errors in the verse already. Is it really scientific to state humans are made from dust? Is it really scientific to say after this occurs the process of a sperm drop, then a blood clot, the medical term for which is a thrombus, which is the product of the blood coagulation step in hemostasis? Medical textbooks do not say blood clots eventually go on to form life. In fact, the reverse is more accurate. The Quran then describes the embryo unscientifically and crudely as a lump of flesh. In other translations, it is called a chewed flesh or chewed substance. People in the 7th century AD and before observed miscarriages, and unfortunately women who were disemboweled. The statements as found in the Quran could have been made by a human, so there is not anything miraculous about it. In actuality, people before Muhammad's time gave a better and more detailed account of embryology, which is far more congruent with modern science than the Quran ever does. For example, nearly 1,000 years before, people such as Aristotle contributed to the field and had a far bigger impact than the Quran. He is cited in the Complete Works of Aristotle, Volume 1, on page 1148. He said, "When the material secreted by the female in the uterus has been fixed by the semen of the male, the more solid part comes together, the liquid is separated off from it, and as the earthy parts solidify and membranes form all around it, this is both necessary result and for a final cause." On page 1149 he continues, "So nature has first designed the two blood vessels from the heart, and from these smaller vessels branch off to the uterus, forming what is called the umbilicus. Around these is a skin-like integument, because the weakness of the vessels needs protection and shelter. The vessels join to the uterus like the roots of plants, and through them the embryo receives its nourishment." Another Western academic cited by Muslims is Dr. Keith Moore. In the 1980s, he accepted an invitation by the Embryology Committee of King Abdulaziz University to produce a special third edition of his successful book, The Developing Human. It was to be used specifically by Muslim students within Islamic universities. He was financially patronized by the Saudi royal family for the use of his name, who has since been quoted by Islamic sources in an attempt to prove embryology as described in the Quran as scientifically correct. Pictured here is the textbook he delivered to the Saudi universities that commissioned the work titled The Developing Human Clinically Oriented Embryology with Islamic Additions. The base textbook was work that Moore had completed years before. He did nothing new for this new edition. The Islamic editions are actually the work of Al-Zindani, who alternates the chapters with his own notes. The result of Moore's and Al-Zindani's collaboration is not an academic book, and subsequent editions omit and contradict the Islamic editions. Dr. Moore never converted to Islam as one would have expected if he truly believed the Quran to be scientifically miraculous in its predictions. In the aforementioned article from the Wall Street Journal, it says in 2002, Dr. Moore declined to be interviewed by journalists on the subject of his work on Islam, stating that it's been many years since he was involved with the Quran. In later editions, Dr. Moore reverts back to his previous renditions by admitting that many cultures and civilizations before Islam contributed to embryology and seems to praise them highly. He only reserves a small section for Islam's contribution with certain incorrect statements, which shows his lack of understanding of the Quran. For example, in the 10th edition of the book, The Developing Human, Clinically Oriented Embryology, on pages 4 and 5, after citing numerous cultures in history, such as the ancient Egyptians, Indians, Greeks, and Jewish contribution towards embryology, reserving special praise for the Greeks who, and I quote, made many important contributions to the science of embryology. On page 5, he cites some Quranic references in a passive and general manner without really affirming or denying its claims, by saying, quote, several references are made to the creation of a human being from a nutfa, small drop. It also states that the resulting organism settles in the womb like a seed 6 days after its beginning. Incidentally, nowhere in the Quran does it say anything about this, which is quite telling about Dr. Moore's knowledge of the Quran. Nonetheless, he then goes on to say, reference is made to the leech-like appearance of the early embryo. Later, the embryo is said to resemble a chewed substance. So in conclusion, the problem with Islam and science apologetics is that it is presumptuous and viciously circular. Its proponents are often guilty of committing the fallacy of begging the question. This is because science is merely correct when it suits the apologist. On record, there are some who have made the claim that the science is incorrect as it is in a state of flux and change, whereas the Quran is always correct, even if it contradicts the science of the day. The majority, however, claim if the Quran is scientifically correct, this then shows that it is the word of God, so says the apologist. To illustrate this, if a statement in the Quran is a miracle claim, or if it is scientifically wrong, such as the sun moving around the earth, coming to a certain resting point, for them it is not really wrong, but the science is wrong, or the specific exegesis is wrong, since it is the word of God anyway, as the language and grammar indicate something different, although the classical scholars who knew the grammar and language better than the modern-day apologists disagree with them. Such stark circularity is viciously indicative of the vacuity of the position and unfortunately telling of the contemporary intellectual vacuum which occupies the minds of the apologists. With such inconsistencies, they cannot maintain intellectual honesty. In the 1980s, Saudi Arabia established a generously financed government organization whose sole purpose was to further the claim that the Quran contained many scientific miracle predictions. They recruited scholars and scientists from around the world, especially targeting Western scientists with huge financial benefits, many of whom never converted to Islam, something that would have been expected if they actually believed in the claims they made in their books. Some later claimed that they were duped and went on to recant their views about the Quranic science claims. Despite this, Muslim apologists are still quoting them and propagating books, articles, and other sources of information saying the Quran contains scientific discoveries not known until modern times. If the Quran contains scientific insight, then why did not a Muslim scientist or academic ever base their research primarily on the Quran and then publish their works stating that their discoveries were made directly based upon their reading of the Quran? Instead, it took non-Muslim scientists to make the discoveries first, and then from around the 1970s and 80s, only after huge funding and financial rewards for apologists and some academics to claim the Quran was already making these claims 1400 years ago. In other words, If indeed the Quran contained scientific and miraculous discoveries, one would have expected Muslims to discover it first based upon their reading of the Quran rather than it being discovered by non-Muslims first.